Hi, my name is Rose Loveall. I own Morningsun Herb Farm, a small herb nursery located in Northern California. Welcome to my 8-week series all about herbs. We're on week 3 of our series. In week 1, we talked all about basils. Week 2, we talked about the 5 essential herbs that every garden should have. They're parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, and oregano. Week 3, we're going to be discussing how to plant a raised planter and how to plant containers with your herbs. It's a really wonderful thing to have in your garden if you don't have a lot of space. So let's talk about raised planter beds. So raised planter beds, as the one you see right in front of me, this is an established bed that needs some work done to it. So why would you plant a raised planter bed? We're on 3 acres here at the nursery and we're in Class A soil. So we could actually plant things directly out into the soil with no problem. But raised planter beds are wonderful because it really allows all of your creativity to kind of show in a small area. It also raises up the soil a little bit into a container, so it warms the soil quickly in the springtime. And then as we get older, it's always nice to not have to be all the way down to ground level in order to harvest your herbs, because a lot of these herbs you're going to be harvesting every day during the season. Raised beds can be made of many different components. This is a raised bed that we knock together very quickly every year in February when we get in our bare root fruit trees. And here the beds are just filled with some compost and our fruit trees, which are just coming out of dormancy. These are just 2x8s, and we use a 4x6 as the center or as the edge posts. So this is used for the edge posts. We are literally just using those to make corners, very quickly knocking them together. This is a raised bed that can be put together literally in 20 minutes. It'll last quite a while. The nice thing is you can pull it apart if you need to very easily. It's not anything beautiful to look at, but you could obviously make this much prettier by simply adding an extra piece, a 2x6 the other direction, where you could actually sit on top of it. Of course, raised beds can be all the way above ground. Raised beds can be those metal cattle troughs, which are all the rage right now. It can be something as simple as just a really big container or a half barrel. This is a raised bed that's a 4-foot by 8-foot raised bed. It's made of redwood, and you can make your raised beds of anything. Now we see a lot of people using cattle troughs for raised beds. This one has these wonderful little edges that you can just drop your 2x6s, or in this case 2x8s, down into to form the corners. It can be just even more soil that you heap into a 4 to 8-inch area in your regular garden beds just to raise it up a little bit. I particularly like raised beds for herbs because many of our herbs are Mediterranean natives and they like good drainage. Here in California, everybody complains about clay soil. We have a clay loam soil here, and it's kind of a heavy soil. I want to show you what our native soil looks like. Now this is our Class A soil here in Northern California. It hasn't been watered in quite a while. It hasn't been watered in, oh boy, about 2 weeks. And you can see how it just lumps together into sort of a hard little Play-Doh-like thing. There's no or very little organic matter. So this is kind of a heavy soil for planting your herbs in. So if this was just in the ground, I would definitely be adding lots of compost to this. A lot of people think they're going to pile in all their native soil right into their raised bed, but using this type of a soil by itself in a raised bed isn't very wise. So you're definitely going to want to add some compost to this. So think of your soil as the foundation for all these herbs. It's kind of the least exciting thing to talk about. Oh, it's brown, it's dirt. You're never going to see it after you plant things. What you really want, right, is all your herbs in and you want to use them and you're all excited about that. But think of the soil as the same thing as a foundation to a house. It's not very interesting. You're not going to take a bath in it. You're not going to make your breakfast in it. But it's what keeps the rest of the house up and happy and structurally sound for 100 years. Think of that same thing with your soil. This is the structure you need to begin with. So this kind of soil, you know you're going to add something to. If I was going to use this in my raised bed, I never do, but if I was going to use some native soil, no more than 30% of your native soil into your raised bed. Very important to remember. Otherwise, what happens is you're going to find that everything's going to sit and puddle. It's not going to drain very well. So in my raised bed, you can see what the soil in here looks like. It's very loose. It's very, we call it friable. It's got lots of organic matter in it. Even though it's pretty wet, it just falls right apart. So this is what you really want for your raised beds. This soil hasn't been amended. I've had this soil in here for about 2 years, and what we do is every spring, we want to add a few inches of soil to it. So we use a bagged soil from E.B. Stone called Raised Bed Mix. I want to show what that basic mix looks like. See how nice and rich that is? It's got lots of compost in it. It's also got some earthworm castings and some chicken manure in it. Really wonderful stuff. Falls apart very easily. So this is what I'm going to be adding to the bed. So when you're building your beds, a lot of people they'll build a whole bunch of beds. They're huge, and then they realize how expensive it is to put your soil in. So make sure you kind of calculate how big your beds are going to be and how much soil you need. In a 4 by 8 foot bed that's about a foot tall, I've got about a foot of soil in here, that's 32 cubic feet, just over a cubic yard of soil. So I would have to add about 22 bags of 1.5 cubic foot size, 22 bags to fill this up. So kind of think about that when you're deciding on how big that bed's going to be. It can be a little bit expensive. You can always get a bulk mix in at first, but even when you add bulk mixes, I usually find that you want to add about 30% organic matter to it. One important thing to also think about is how wide's your bed going to be? People build like an 8 by 8 foot bed, and then you have to step into the bed in order to get into it. You want to make sure that without too much work, or even if you're sitting on a chair, you can reach the center of the bed from all sides. So that's why 4 feet is really kind of a maximum for the average person for what is comfortable for them to work in. I'm also going to add some fertilizer. Since this bed is established, I could add it just to each plant, but I'm going to actually top dress. And again, I love to use something like the Sure Start. It's an organic, so for your culinary plants, you really want to use a nice organic mix. So it's 4-6-2, 4% nitrogen, 6% phosphorus, 2% potassium. So I'm going to just broadcast this across the top, putting it all around existing plants. And then I'm going to add a little soil on top of this. The one thing I am not good at doing, so I always like to mention it to people because I don't do it very well, is you should make sure that you have some kind of a system put in for watering. This bed's only going to get watered once a week. Because I'm here all the time, I literally live where I work, it's easy for me to come out once a week and water this bed. But suppose you want to go on vacation, you're going to want to make sure that you've got this hooked up to some sort of a water system. Okay, your fertilizer is in. We're going to mix that in. I'm actually going to put some of this raised bed mix on top. So, because this is all organic matter, you know that it's going to break down over time. So breaking down over time, that's a great thing because this organic mix builds the soil. This feeds the worms, feeds all that microflora, microfauna in the soil. It's going to make it a much better, much healthier soil. So long as you are always feeding your soil, which is the way to think of it rather than feeding your plants, you'll have a nice, healthy soil. Once you've top dressed the soil, it's kind of nice to mix that soil in a little bit with the existing soil. First of all, you're going to be mixing your fertilizers down a little bit deeper that way. Also, you get the soil to be a little more homogeneous, and you're going to break up any hardening of the soil that has developed over the year. It does disturb the root systems a little bit. Herbs in general aren't going to mind having their root systems disturbed a little. Remember that your fertilizers are organic, so your helpers might think they're delicious. Another reason we like to mix it in, to kind of deter the dog, my darling Dexter, for example, from licking all the fertilizer right off the top. Also, a lot of organic fertilizers work much better when they're in contact with the soil. So it's a good idea to mix them in so they're immediately in contact with the soil. All right. So that's a pretty good first mixing. And you notice there's no hard spots in here. So my trowel really digs down in there deep each time, working things in. This raised bed has some plants in it that I'm happy with, that are established, and I'm going to keep in this bed. I'm going to remove a few plants now, or make a few a little bit smaller before I add some new plants. Last week, as we were talking about our 5 essential herbs, we did talk about thyme. And I mentioned that thyme is short-lived, and then it gets kind of, it just sort of loses its vigor after a couple of years. So these are a couple English thyme that have been in the ground for 2 years. I'm going to dig these up now. I'm going to remove them all together. And you notice they're still really well rooted. The main reason I'm taking them out, I'm going to put in new plants, is because really, after a couple of years, they just don't have that same vigor to them. On the other hand, some plants are too vigorous. So oregano, one of the other plants we talked about yesterday, can get really big. Here is our oregano plant right in here. This is Greek oregano, so kind of that spicy flavor. And you notice it started from one little pot and it just keeps going and going and going. So I'm actually going to lift a little bit out and remove it. For this I might need my clippers. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. The nice thing about things like oregano is they're almost indestructible. So here you've got this little rooted piece of oregano. You can make it a little bit smaller so you take some of the stress off of it here. That little piece would be a nice little start for your friend, your family member. And that's all it would take to start a new plant right there. So I'm just going to pull a little bit of it out, just to give me a little more space in here, because I love oregano, but I want to make sure I can include some of my other essential herbs in here. Dexter, no helping yourself to the fertilizer. He goes, why not? It's delicious. I don't understand. I like it. Okay, so we're ready to put in some new herbs into our garden. This raised bed is going to be a perennial raised bed. So, and it's also going to be a raised bed that's better for a drought-tolerant types of herbs. So I'm not going to include some of the things we talked about over the last couple of weeks. There's not going to be any basil in here. There's not going to be any parsley in here because those like quite a bit more water. And I'm only watering this garden once a week. I'm going to water it in deeply. That's right at your level, isn't it? Yes, it is. So what kinds of things are we going to be adding to our garden? First of all, what kinds of things are here already? A couple of our essential herbs are already in here. Here's one of our sages. This is our variegated Burgarten sage coming into bloom right here. Just looking really beautiful. Two kinds of oregano. Greek oregano right here. Nice and sturdy, crawls along, got kind of a spicy flavor. And the very spicy Sicilian oregano right here with that silvery gray foliage. I've also got some fabulous plants that we will be talking about in much more detail later on. Rose-scented geranium coming into bloom. This is one of those that I wish you could smell on the other side of this camera because it smells like roses. A wonderful culinary herb, a little more unusual. I also have a lemon-scented geranium. So when you scratch the leaves, oh, smells like very sweet lemon. We use the flowers, of course, because the flowers are edible, but as important is the foliage. So I always like to include a couple of these in my culinary garden. They're a little unusual and they're always so wonderfully fragrant. So don't forget kind of the weird unusual herbs also. I've also got a lemongrass. The lemongrass here is looking a little bit like it needs to be pruned back, and I will give this a prune today, so when we're all done we can take a final look at it. It's got some of its old foliage. Super easy to grow. It's great in a raised bed because lemongrass, you generally are taking out the bottom parts here for cooking. So in a raised bed it's really easy to pull out a piece of the bottom. Also, we've got some thyme. The thyme we ripped out we're going to replace. We have some wonderful spicy orange thyme right here. And next to it we have a very unusual herb called salad burnet that has leaves that taste like cucumber. And so that's kind of a fun herb. It looks nice all year round. It's a little bit invasive, or a joyous spreader. It's already getting ready to bloom right here. But it's, again, another kind of fun one to add a little bit of interest to your garden. So it's not going to just be your little essential herbs here. Finally, I've also got a different oregano. We'll talk about this more on another session. This is called Mexican oregano, very different plant. And I've got French tarragon. And what we find with our French tarragon is that in a raised bed here, it does much, much better. It does not like wet feet at all. So we want to make sure we keep it lifted at all times to keep it nice and dry. So I'm going to add some herbs today. I love thymes. And I love thymes because, first of all, they don't take up a lot of space in the garden. So I have silver thyme, which is a super strong flavored thyme, and my English Wedgwood thyme, which is my favorite because that variegation is so pretty, but also it has a big fat leaf, so it's really easy to harvest. Sometimes they're so tiny you spend a lot of time just dealing with your thymes. So I like to put those on the corner Again, in a bed where you can reach it from all sides, you put the tallest thing in the middle, and then you kind of work your way down in general to your shorter items. If it's up against a wall so you can only get to one side, obviously the tall stuff goes in the back, shorter stuff goes towards the front. I mentioned we're going to put in French tarragon, and I like to hedge my bets, so I also am going to put in some Mexican tarragon. So here's more French tarragon I'm going to add today, but I'm also going to add Mexican tarragon. Mexican tarragon, Tagetes lucida. It is a perennial marigold. So it's getting ready to bloom right now. It has that sweet fragrance of anise, but it's easier to grow. On the edge, we've already got one of our savories. Savory we'll talk about more in another session. This is winter savory. Pepper. Tastes and smells like pepper. This one is an evergreen. Today we're going to add summer savory, which is a little bit lighter flavor on the pepper. This one is an annual. So this is the one annual thing I'm going to tuck in here today. Just because it is still very drought tolerant, does really well. Marjoram, closely related to the oreganos, but a lot better behaved. Marjoram is about an 8-inch perennial. I'm going to tuck that in right over here. We don't have any rosemary out here. Rosemary is really important. So I'm going to add my favorite, the Golden Rain rosemary. Again, you can see that beautiful variegation. This is about a 2-footer, so we're going to put that towards the middle. An herb we'll talk about more later. This is another savory, like the winter and the summer savory. This is lemon savory. Lemon pepper, and I'm a big chicken and fish eater in the summertime, so I love this one. Nice root system. A little bit smaller, so I like to put this kind of over towards the edge. That's only going to get about 8 or 10 inches tall. Finally, we have to add some chives. I'm going to put in some garlic chives with a white bloom, kind of a flat leaf instead of the rounded leaf. So a nice flat leaf, and it smells and tastes like kind of a sweet spring garlic. And lovage. Lovage is an unusual one. This is going to get kind of big. It produces this big fat bulb that you can harvest at the end of the year. And the leaves taste like celery. And you can use, the stems get really big later on. You can use the stems as your little swizzle stick in your Bloody Mary. So this is a really good one to include in many kinds of gardens. So here we've got kind of a basic setup to add to our established bed. I've already worked in that compost. If I didn't want to add like an individual, or if I didn't want to top dress all that fertilizer like I did before, I could always just come in and add fertilizer to the individual. But this way I'm also fertilizing the established plants at the same time. Because most of these are hardy perennials, they don't really need a lot of fertilizer throughout the year. At the beginning, that's usually about all it takes. A lot of us like to make sure we keep our tags with the plants so we aren't going, what is that again? Is that thyme or what is that? So here we're going to just plant right in, and I'm going to kind of add to my little tarragon bed. Tarragon is a perennial, but here we tend to grow it as an annual because we have heavy soils. And those heavy soils tend to take out the plant in the winter. It doesn't come back year after year. Once you find a really good space for it though, which is a space with excellent drainage summer and winter, it will have no problems finding a nice bed, and it will actually grow to be 3 or 4 feet wide. So if you've done this year after year, keep trying, especially now that maybe you have a couple more tips, because once it's in a good spot, you'll have tarragon there for the rest of your life. Tarragon is an herb that's used a lot for French cooking, which sounds so specific, but French cooking, so things like sauces, all kinds of white sauces, fish and chicken. And so you think about it here, and chicken salad with tarragon and grapes is a fabulous summer meal. It has a bit of a licoricey flavor. So a lot of people go, like me, licorice, ew, but it's not licorice. It's like an anise, sweet anise flavor. It adds just a lot of depth to things like chicken and fish. And any sort of a white sauce, people will add it to a hollandaise sauce, for example. We all know rosemary, of course. We talked about that last week. I told you all I think about is potatoes. I love potatoes. So, potatoes and rosemary, potatoes and barbecue, barbecue and rosemary. You notice here I broke up the root system a little bit just because it's starting to circle around. So you want to stop that from happening. You don't have to really pound down the plants. You can just do it nice and gently. When your soil is very friable, you'll see that you can even work it with your hands. You don't have to dig a huge hole into everything. One other really good reason to put in a raised bed is if you have critters that come into your garden, especially moles, voles, or gophers, you could line the bottom of this with hardware cloth, 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch hardware cloth, tap it onto the sides of the wood, and that would make it so that no gophers or moles can come up through there and get your plants. So it makes it an excellent choice for tomatoes. My soil is relatively dry today, so I'll definitely water this in, of course, as soon as I get everything planted. You notice I'm not planting it any deeper than the existing soil level. So when you come in, you can always put just a little soil around the top, but you don't want to completely cover it up with soil. You don't want to do this. That's a no-no. That will tend to rot out many different kinds of herbs. So you want to leave some breathing space there. Plant our winter or our lemon savory. I love this plant. And finally, one more little time. Again, for me, I can never grow too many times. It's nice to have the scented times, the flavored times, a really strong time like silver thyme. If I'm making meatballs or something like that, you want something that's got a really strong flavor to it. You can always add a few little flowers in here, and I'm going to put just one of our little calendulas in here, just to get a little bit of flowers. This will give us a nice little pop of yellow flowers in the next couple of weeks. Of course, a lot of our culinary herbs are going to put on flowers during the season. It's really wonderful to bring in pollinators. It's also good because they're all edible. So I mentioned that we'll prune things back also. The nice thing about herbs is they kind of tell you. So for example, this Mexican oregano, you can prune this back quite a bit. Notice I'm cutting it back to just above another branch that has green leaves on it. Actually, I'm going to cut that all the way back. So this way, it's going to encourage growth farther down, like we're starting to encourage growth way down in here. That way we'll get a nice full plant this spring. Also, if you see that some of your plants are looking a little shabby, like the lemongrass, you can prune it back. This is going to give you all new leaves. The top part of lemongrass can be used for tea making. It makes a really wonderful tea. This lemongrass will not go to waste. You can put it in your compost pile, of course. You could just let it lie beside the bed and let it compost right there in place. It'll have this wonderful smell to it. We have 3 little mini donkeys, though, and they adore lemongrass. So they're going to get all this lemongrass today. They'll be very happy. They'll have to share it with the goat, the chickens. Okay, so this is going to encourage nice new growth on the lemongrass. You could also, if you have time, go through and carefully remove any dead leaves, but even just this alone is going to give us a nice full plant again. Lemongrass is also used as a repellent for mosquitoes. So it's another great plant to have in your garden to help keep the mosquitoes away. So here we have the beginnings of our garden. We'll look at this in about a month to see how much has grown in, if any gophers have wiped out anything, if any dogs have wiped out anything. But it's a good start to a nice perennial herb garden that's going to supply you with all kinds of flavors throughout the summer season. So this is a larger, deeper raised bed down at Soul Food Farm, my neighbor down the road. And she's put some wonderful, lovely culinary herbs as well as some landscaping herbs in her beds. So this bed is 10 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. So this is 80 cubic feet worth of soil you need to add, or 3 cubic yards of soil. So keep that in mind as you're putting your beds together. Of course, the nice thing about this is, she's got a nice 2x4 on the edge. You can sit on the bed and work your way in. So when I'm 80 or when I'm 64 and losing my hair, I'll want a bed like this so I can reach into the middle and I can just be sitting on the edge of the bed. Very comfortable. It's really worth moving those beds up high. As we get a little bit older, it makes it a lot easier in order to get into the bed. In this bed, we have one of our favorite little lemony herbs. We talked about it last week. This is golden lemon thyme, and here it's coming into bloom. Just starting its spring bloom now. So if you like lemon thyme, for example, my neighbor Alexis, she actually harvests this to sell. You want a nice bed of lemon thyme like this so you can harvest part of it and then part of it you can be growing on. She's also got some calendula. Calendulas are great for cosmetics especially, and also they're edible flowers and they make a nice tea. Beautiful flowers. Again, this is April here in Northern California, and you can see they're already coming into full bloom. So really a fun little herb to grow. It's also called pot marigold. Easy to grow. Once you have it usually forever. And then a landscaping herb. This is catmint. This is a beautiful variety called purple haze. If you're trying to bring some pollinators into your garden, especially some nice honeybees or our native bees, this is a wonderful herb to grow. You don't cook with it. Usually cats are not attracted to it, but it's got this amazing flower that brings in a ton of bees. It's a fun one to watch. Again, if you had one close to your vegetable garden, it'd be a great one for all spring and summer to bring pollinators in. You do want to always watch your soils. So for example, we've got a bed over here. This was one of the first beds she did, and she used primarily her native soil. Now she's lucky, she's got 55 acres. I would kill for 55 acres. So she's got a lot of soil, but here's how tough this is. So this was her kind of her learning experience. There's that raised bed soil. It's just her native soil. So not only is there no organic material in it, but it's pretty much hard as a rock, okay? And it's really heavy. So what happens when this native soil gets watered or gets rained on, what you end up with is a soil that holds water in far too long. The problem is that some herbs are willing to put up with that. Again, she's got a giant bed of regular lemon thyme here, really coming into bloom. Amazing and beautiful. And because thyme is shallow rooted, it doesn't mind so much having a heavy soil underneath it. Sage, on the other hand, we talked about sage last week, one of our primary herbs, hates to have wet feet. So probably started right here with a root rot. That's Batman the cat. And then it spread over here, and now it's spreading over here. So that's classic root rot, which people tend to think is actually not enough water. But what's happened is the root systems have rotted. So I won't pull this up because it's not my garden, but I can tell you that the roots under there are rotted away. It's spread here and it's spread there. So far she's got that beautiful variegated sage, which is holding on, and you know, some of the sages may survive, but some of them are going to just poop out. So it's really taking out these three. So you want to make sure that that's not what your soil looks like. Okay, and after this bed, she really started to use a lot more. See, I mean, that's like Play-Doh there. No life in there at all. Doesn't work in a raised bed because you're just relying on gravity to draw the water out of the soil. It's sitting right directly on soil, which is great because anything that's bigger, if you were to put a tree in here, for example, is going to root down directly into the native soil once it's taken up its space in here. But you can see some things are going to thrive even when you give it poor soil. Some things are going to really suffer, like sage is the number one thing that does not like wet feet. The height of these beds, though, is great. So as you age, move your beds up a little higher. Makes it a lot easier to get to them. So the newest rage in raised beds, containerized gardening, is to use these livestock troughs. So they're all galvanized metal. Of course, they don't have any holes in them. So the first thing you do in these big, giant troughs is you're going to put in maybe 40 to 50 holes in the bottom of that trough. You want to make sure you have really good drainage out the bottom of the trough. After that, you're going to fill it with a raised bed mix, not your native soil, and then you can put in your beautiful herbs. In this trough, she's dedicated it just to sage and oregano. The sage is all in beautiful bloom right now, and we remember what we love about all of our flowers. You can harvest your flowers. Really looks pretty, and then you can put it on your pasta. You wouldn't normally throw a leaf of sage in your mouth, but a flower of sage is delicious. It's sweet and floral, and it has that nectar in it, so it's really nice. So, of course, you don't want to eat them all because you want to have the honeybees come and visit you as well. But you can see how you can dedicate one trough to just a couple of different herbs, and then you can have a huge area. Just sage, just oregano in your bed. It's up nice and high. You're never going to have to lean over to get to these plants. They're going to be up at least at waist high this way. So these gardening troughs are great to use. They're easy to refill. You would just add a little bit more soil, turn the soil in as you saw us doing with the wooden raised bed at my nursery. And then you could add in new plants, different plants. You can dedicate them to flowers. You could even put a tree into them. This is a butterfly bush in one of them, rosemary in one. Fun and easy to grow with, has kind of a cool retro chic ranch country farm look to it. Throw in all the words. And it's really a great way to just sort of bring a little bit more into a small area, a little bit of creativity. So in these larger beds, these are 2 by 6 foot beds, 2 by 6 by almost 2 feet tall. So that's 24 cubic feet of soil. There's that math problem for the day, 2 by 6 by 2. And so you're going to need quite a bit of soil for each of these. You're going to be looking at about 2/3 of a yard to put in each one of these. So it does take up a little soil, but the thing to remember is you spend that money on the soil, it might be $150 or so per bed for the soil. But if you put good soil in at the very beginning, it's just like the foundation of your home. You will have that foundation, and all you need to do is add to it to keep feeding that soil. If you put in a crummy foundation, it's just like your home. You've got to lift the whole darn thing up and spend a whole lot of money rejuvenating it. So start from the beginning, spend a little more money on that part that's the least exciting, which is the soil, and make sure you have a good foundation. After that, that's what she's done here, and you can have big, giant, blooming sages and oreganos and rosemarys in your bed. So sometimes you don't have enough room for a raised bed, or you want to put containers maybe close to your kitchen door or on your windowsill, or you only have a little patio to actually grow herbs on. So you're going to choose some smaller size containers to grow your herbs in. So what size container to use and what kind of container to use? I've got both plastic containers here, like the gray ones, and then I've got this beautiful green one that's actually made of concrete that is kind of a hernia maker. It's a nice, heavy, thick container, hard to move around, but terrific to use because in really hot areas, it's going to have a tendency to keep your soil more constant temperature. So it really protects the soil, the roots of the plants a little bit more from getting too overheated. There are some kinds of plants that we always grow in containers. The number one plant we always grow in container is mint. Mint will spread endlessly through your garden, so it's really a good idea to always plant your mints in some kind of a container. I've got 5 mints here that I've spread around this pot. I've got beautiful pineapple mint, but I've also got banana mint, orange mint, strawberry mint, and pear mint. So, you know, you don't have to just live with peppermint and spearmint and peppermint. You can do all of these great fruity mints. They're a little teeny bit less invasive, which means they'll only travel at the speed of sound, not the speed of light. And they are fun for your herbal teas in the summertime. I mean, how wonderful to have a strawberry mint tea, or to chop this into a fruit salad, or to try a little bit different mojito. How about having a pineapple mint mojito or an orange mint mojito rather than just your regular spearmint mojito? Growing them all in containers, in a container like this together, generally means that every year you're going to have to pull them out and divide them back up because they will really tend to grow together. This is a perfect example of how quickly mints can grow and why you put them in containers. So you keep that in the container, or you can cut that off. If you have this pot right down in your garden space, the second it pops out here and hits the ground, away it goes. I mean, it's gone. It's going to take over. So make sure you keep track of your mints, even though they're in pots. Mint is another great one because people are always looking for wonderful things you can grow in containers in the shade. And mint is the perfect one. It actually does really well in a little bit of shade, and prefers to grow in a little bit of shade, and the flavors are going to be much, much better. So I'm going to put these 5 all in one container. This is about a 7-gallon container here. So I've used a good potting soil. Again, I've used an EB Stone potting soil. You can see it's a nice, rich potting soil. It's got some pumice. It's got some aged fir bark and redwood. It's also got quite a bit of peat moss, which is really a good one to use for your container soils that we don't usually have in our raised bed mixes. It's also got a little bit of earthworm castings and then some organic slow release fertilizers already in it. So theoretically, to start our plants, we don't even have to add any additional fertilizer. I did put in for each plant about a teaspoon worth of Sure Start fertilizer just to give it a little extra punch. So again, the soil here is very homogeneous. It's the same type of soil all the way down. It's a little bit on the moist side. If it's super dry, you want to make sure that you do wet your container soil before you actually plant. But this has a little bit of moisture, so it's going to take up water very easily. Some of my herbs, some of my mints are just starting to really take off in the pot, so you don't really have to do much to those mints. Some of my mints, like this pineapple mint, I bet, oh yeah, that's got quite a root system on it. So you can either tear it or you can cut it. I love pineapple mint. Again, these mints are all really fun to throw in if you're doing like a fruit salad in the summertime. Watermelon salad with some feta cheese, some basil, and then some of these mints. It's really delicious. And just for teas in the summer, it makes a huge difference to have all these different kinds of mints. Some people really shy away from mint because they've grown one in the ground and they maybe in some cases just decided to sell their house rather than figure out how to get rid of that mint. It's that invasive. But in a container, again, here you've got your orange mint. Wow, you can see how quickly it puts on a big root system. So this one, it really is a good idea to just cut it, at least in one direction. That stops the roots from going this direction and gets them to grow out into the soil. So roughing up your roots on your herbs is never a bad idea, especially if they start to get a little bit of root bound. You notice I don't fill up the soil all the way to the tip top. This one too, you see how happy that root system is? That's really a happy root system. The reason I don't like to fill it up all the way to the top is because you want to make sure you have a good water basin in there. If it's all the way to the top, water just spills right out. So you always want to make sure you leave a little bit of space. So there's your mints. Happy, contained, but ready for you to use for all your different cooking and tea needs. So, and remember, they're good digestives too. So a nice cup of banana mint tea, or banana mint actually is great with chocolate. So it's a wonderful dessert mint. Orange is great for tea making. Your sweet pear mint is a really fun one for adding to vodka drinks. Strawberry mint is delicious to add to all kinds of fruit salads and probably has one of the prettiest flowers I've ever seen. And of course, pineapple mint is just beautiful even as a garnish. In a container, contained. You're going to harvest it frequently. If you don't harvest your mints, they get bitter. So people will wonder what's wrong with their mint. Why is it so bitter? It's because you're not harvesting it enough. Cut it back, make sure it's well watered, and fertilize this pot once a month. So when you're harvesting your mints, instead of just taking individual leaf, prune whole branches off. This keeps the plant nice and tidy and close in, and that way you get quite a bit of mint for one little piece. Great for making your teas. You can really prune back your mints too. You could prune it mint all the way back that far. You could do that all the way around the plant and you would not disturb that plant at all. It's hard to over-harvest a mint. That's the first thing people find. So the mints all have one particular water requirement, and that's why it's nice to put them in one pot together. Also, we have these leafy type plants. So in the container, in the raised bed that we did earlier on, we just did our perennial herbs and those things that need less water. Here we have two pots that are going to need more water. They're also in a plastic pot, which means that they're susceptible to changes in temperature a lot more. So with these kind of pots, it's always great to group them together. If they're grouped together, then only the outer pots tend to get battered by the heat of the day. So the pots behind will stay a little bit cooler. You also have a tendency not to put them on like the very hottest part of your patio or deck or right up against a wall, particularly in a place like Northern California. It gets really hot. So here I've got some leafy type of herbs. We talked about some of these last week and the week before. We've got curly and flat leaf parsley. And then we have our beautiful Italian basil. We also have a red vein sorrel, which is a lemony flavored herb, a great salad green, and also a really nice one to make pesto out of. And then I've included a nasturtium. Nasturtium is going to give us this great peppery flavor from the leaves. Later on, it'll put on a beautiful flower that's also going to taste like pepper. The nice thing about grouping these all together in a container is they all have similar water and fertilizer needs. This pot is about a 3-gallon size pot. This pot's going to get watered in the middle of the summer, probably every day. Okay, so it's going to be a lot. Remember, I told you the raised bed, maybe once a week for those big perennial herbs. These are leafy greens and they want a lot more water. So they're also going to want more fertilizer. I mentioned that I'd put some slow release fertilizer in here. You're going to want to either liquid feed with a little bit of, well, you can use an inorganic fertilizer. Since these are all culinaries, I certainly prefer to use sea kelp and a little bit of fish emulsion. And we're going to fertilize every 2 weeks. So completely different fertilizer and watering than we're going to do with our perennial bed. That perennial bed, we'd come back in and fertilize it maybe once every 3 months, 6 months. It just doesn't need that much. Okay, here we've got all annual or biennial. Remember the parsleys? You're going to plant in year 1, and in year 2, they're going to go to flower and die. Again, we've only taken it to that lip as far as the soil goes, so we have a nice space here for watering. You can put, here I don't have a saucer under it, you can put a saucer under, but only if you keep that saucer dry. So after you water, you want to drain the saucer. None of your herbs are going to appreciate wet feet. They all want to drain really well. Okay, so this deeper pot like this is great for these herbs like your basil that are going to put on a bigger, deeper root system. So you're going to get much better growth through that root system. You notice this container here, it was big, 22 inches around, but it's very shallow. Great for growing things like mint that have a shallow root system. They just tend to root right along the top of the plant. So here you've got all your leafy herbs. You're going to water that in, and when you do water, you're going to water completely. So you water all the way down to the bottom of the pot. This is just going to be for basils, and this is perfect for a little windowsill garden. So here I'm putting, notice this is much shallower. It's only 8 inches deep. I'm going to put those basils in that that are going to stay smaller, so they don't need such a big, deep root system. Again, you can cut, or you can even just tease apart the root system a little bit. And then you're going to plant these guys. I've planted 3 in this pot, which would be a lot if I was trying to plant, I mean, you wouldn't plant a rosemary, a sage, and oregano in this size pot because you really wouldn't, it wouldn't fit in there longer than about a month. These little guys stay smaller, right? These basils are red ball, this one's spicy bush, and this one is Persian. So I've got kind of a nice one for making pesto. The spicy bush is very strong flavored, so that one's a good one for cooking with, making my sauces. And this Persian's just a little bit different. Has a bit of a clovey lemon scent to it. So I'm going to use this for garnishing and for throwing in with salad greens. A little bit different look. All three of them will stay a little bit smaller, so they'll work in a container this size. Nice little windowsill garden for your basil. And the plants are only going to get about this tall, so the root system works well for that size of pot. I'll fertilize these just like this one. So every 2 weeks this gets fertilizer. That's always a shock to people who think that your herbs don't need much fertilizer. You are going to be fertilizing with a liquid fertilizer every 2 weeks, or you're going to be digging in a little bit of your organic slow release fertilizer every 2 weeks. Lots of fertilizer, lots of love for these guys. Remember, your raised bed was only getting fertilizer once every 3 months or so. And your mints also would appreciate a little bit of fertilizing, but they're nowhere near as picky as your basils and your parsleys, your sorrel, those kinds of herbs. So the last point you want to make with your pots, it's really important with your containers that you use containers that have holes in the bottom. And this is one of those things that is sort of evident, self-evident, but people forget about it, and they choose these really cute pots and containers with no holes in the bottom of the containers at all. So the problem with that is you don't get any drainage. And with no drainage, what happens is you just give this anaerobic kind of stinky, smells like rotten egg smell to your soil, and it kills the root systems pretty quickly. So what you find, stop biting the bees. Did you get stung? If you did, you deserved it. You have to learn to be a farm dog. Farm dogs don't bite bees. If you don't have holes in the bottoms of your containers, it's a problem as far as drainage. So you want to make sure that if you're getting a container like a trough, people love to use all sizes of those garden troughs now. They don't come with holes because they're meant for livestock, to give water for livestock, and so you need to drill plenty of holes in the bottom. Finally, you notice I only put soil in these pots. I didn't put rocks on the bottom or change the drainage in any way. If you get a good garden soil, again, we use an EB Stone product called Edna's Best. It's a good product all the way through. You don't need to change the drainage of it. So for herbs, they don't like to have rocks on the bottom with soil on top. You just make it so that the drainage is uneven. So put the same type of soil all the way through the pot, whether it's a shallow pot or a deep container, whether it's a raised bed or a garden trough. We'll be checking back in with our containers over the next few weeks to see how they're faring. Next week, we're going to be talking all about lemon herbs, including this wonderful lemongrass that my donkeys love. See you next week. I love you. My little Leroy, my little Angelica. These two are like the mellowest creatures. I know. I know. You're my mamacita. And you smell pretty. You smell like hay. All right, you guys, was that a nice little treat?